Hello, I'm Randy Black. I'm the Fire Chief for Durango Fire Protection District. This video is going to try to explain to you some of the challenges of property tax, of how it's accrued, how they're calculated, the challenges that we have moving forward into the next 3 years with some of the changes that have been put into place by the state legislature. This is definitely a technical video, trying to get into the details. If you're really confused by this, I get it. Trying to do a budget by this is crazy. Property tax is really hard for people to understand, and it just keeps getting more and more confusing. So we've tried to break this down in easy terms for you to understand. So I'm going to give you kind of a glossary of terms and explain this and do our best. So we're going to try. If you have questions, feel free to get a hold of us and ask, but we'll go ahead and get into the video here. So first thing I want to do is explain some terms. So tax year. So taxes are paid in the year following the year that they're accrued. So the 2025 taxes are actually paid in calendar year 2026. This is complicated when we discuss tax years versus calendar years because they're two separate years. So calendar year is the actual year that you're in. So we're currently in 2025. So the property taxes that you paid this year are actually for tax year 2024. So that's tax year and calendar year. The actual value of your property is the county assessor. It's their estimate of the market value of your property. So for this discussion, we're going to use the amount $750,000 for residential properties and $1 million for commercial properties. That would be the assessor's best guess at market value of your property just for the purpose of these calculations. The assessed value, that is the actual value that we just talked about, that 750 or whatever the market value is, that's multiplied times the assessment rate gives you the assessed value. The assessment rate is the percentage that's applied to each classification of property that you pay tax on. Property classification, the type of property that determines the assessment rate. So this is broken down into the following categories. Residential for local government, there's a separate assessment rate that's residential for schools, vacant land, commercial lodging, industrial, agricultural, state assessed renewable energy. Those are all the different categories of property classification. So what's changed since 2017? Durango Fire Protection District in 2017 went forward with a mill levy increase of 2.5 mils that we added to our base to be able to accomplish some goals. We did accomplish those goals. We were able to fund our staff, we addressed our capital needs, and we were able to move forward with those things. The challenge has been that since that time, the state has reduced the assessment rates, the numbers that we talked about up above, the percentages that are applied to the properties, and that has basically not allowed us to keep up with our costs and to keep up with the economy. They used property values that were escalating dramatically on the Front Range and applied them globally across the state. So those sweeping statewide assessment adjustments have really hurt our department. So now the residential assessment rates are varying and changing by the year, even for 2026. So for this next year, which is only a couple months away, we don't know what the assessment rate is going to be until October of this year. We believe it's going to be 6.25%. But if the state experiences growth over 5%, it could drop to 6.15%. In 2027, it increases from 6.25 to 6.8. But then you take a 10% reduction off the actual value up to $70,000 before the assessed rate is calculated. Commercial rates have been steadily decreasing from 29% in 2017 to 25% heading into 2027. New categories of properties have been added. What used to be a fairly straightforward calculation is now horribly complicated algebra problems with moving parts creating havoc with the assessors and with anybody who receives property tax funding. So two of the goals that we're trying to accomplish with this election are correcting our capital funding shortages and staffing operational funding shortages. Those are direct results of the assessment rates that have been cut by the state legislature. The other two that we're trying to achieve, the other two goals, are to build the station in Three Springs and staff that station. Those are our four, but specifically when we're talking about the property tax, these are some of our challenges. So how do mills work, and what are mills? Mills are a way of calculating property tax amounts. So you take the actual value of a property, as we said above, residential or commercial, you multiply it times the assessment rate to get the assessed value. Then you multiply the assessed value times the mills. That's the amount of tax that you pay. That's the formula that comes out. So in our question that's on the ballot, year one, the equivalent is 3.59 mils. The reason it's 3.59 in year one and the question says 4.45 is there's planned and staggered decreases in the assessment rates to where 3.59 mils in year one is going to be equal to the same amount of money as 4.45 mils in 2028. So we used a company called Hilltop Securities to do this math, to calculate these differences and make sure that we were coming up with an accurate amount to where if we come to the taxpayers and ask for an increase, it would be really embarrassing if in 3 years we hadn't asked for enough to be able to support the programs that we told you we were going to accomplish. And so there was about a 0.8 or 0.9 mil change that we needed to do to compensate for those changes. So there's a lot of variables affecting calendar years 2026, 27, and 28 that will affect the assessment rate calculation in mills. The numbers below, I'm going to give you some formulas and some examples, are estimates if we stick with the assessment rates and values from calendar year 2026, which is tax year 2025, and assume that there is less than 5% growth statewide. And again, we'll get into the details and help understand why this is so confusing. So let me give you an example. For calendar year 2026, so next year that we're going into, you'll be paying taxes for 2025. I'm going to give you a residential example. So an actual value would be $750,000. So if you have a house that is worth $750,000, the assessment rate next year is 6.25%. So 6.25% of $750,000 is $46,875. So that is the assessed value. Then you multiply that times the 3.59 mils, and that generates the tax bill. The increase would be $168 over the period of a year. But what that also means is that you're paying mills only on 6.25% of your residential property value. So when people say my property went up, say 10%, that doesn't mean your tax bill goes up 10%. That means you're paying 6.25% of the 10% increase. So it does get confusing. And just to complicate it even further, if the state growth, so if Colorado State grows larger or faster above 5%, then the assessment rate in 2026 drops to 6.15 from 6.25. So the $750,000 house times 6.15 is $46,125 times the 3.59 mils is $165. So $2.69 less for some really complicated math. So I want to also give you a commercial example. And commercial is taxed. And again, this is all the way the state has set up property funding. So this is not the fire department or the counties or the schools or anybody else's choice. This is the formulas that we are handed. So for calendar year 2026, tax year 2025, the commercial property example I'm going to give you is a value of $1 million of commercial value. So you take $1 million, next year the tax rate for commercial property is 27%, so quite a bit higher than the residential rate. So 27% times $1 million is $270,000. That's the assessed value. Multiply that times the 3.59 mils is $969. So again, you're paying mills or you're paying tax on 27% of the value of your commercial property. So now let's run some numbers for the future years so you understand why there's a difference between year one and the future years. So for calendar year 2027, tax year 2026 for residential, again, we're going to stick with the $750,000 residential property. Starting in that year, you've got $750,000, but you take 10% off of the top of the actual value up to $70,000. So 10% of $750,000 is $75,000. So that exceeds that. The cap is 70. So you get to take $70,000 off of the $750,000 house. So that's $680,000. You multiply that times 6.8%. That's $46,240. Assessed value times 4.45 mils is $205. So that means you're paying tax on 6.8% of your residential property's value after you take a 10% reduction. If the state growth is more than 5%, then the assessment rate in 2027, tax year 2026, drops to 6.7%. In that same example of the $750,000 house, that drops the tax down to $202 for that year. So now we've seen the residential for the future years. So now let's take a look at a commercial example. So the actual value, our $1 million property that we'll continue to use as an example. In 2027, tax year 2026, the property taxes start to drop. So the assessment rate drops to 26%. So that means we're now assessing it off of $260,000 of the assessed value. 4.45 mils times that is $1,157. So you're paying on 2027, tax year 2026, you're paying on 26% of the value of your property's value. In 2028, which is tax year 2027, the commercial example, we're going to stick with that $1 million property. The tax continues, the assessment rate continues to drop. That year it's 25%. So that means that year, instead of the $1 million, you're paying on $250,000. The year before you were paying on $260,000. The year before that you're paying on $270,000. So you can see that the assessed value is continuing to drop. So then we take that times the 4.45 mils is $1,112. So again, you're paying tax on 25% of the value of your commercial property value. For actual value assessments, just so you understand how this all works, the county is required in state statute to do a full mandatory statewide reappraisal on the odd number years. So right now it's 2025, we're in an odd year. They just did a reassessment rate. That rate basically stays steady for 2 years. So that means that's the dollar amount that we'll be looking at, and that's the assessment rate for tax year 2025, which is payable in 2026. So in 2026 and 2027, the values basically are fixed. Then they'll do another reassessment and we can see if the adjustments go up or down at that point. In addition, there's a senior citizen exemption for those of you that don't know. So if you're a senior citizen, 65 years or older, and you qualify, so it's your primary residence, you own the residence. Obviously, if you're paying rent, then you're not paying the property tax. So you have to own the property, qualify, then you get a 50% exemption on the first $200,000 of actual value for your primary residence. So with all that said, you can see that the property taxes are very confusing, but they are also a stable source for us to be able to find funding to be able to move forward. So please look at the rest of the tabs on this page. There's a lot of information that's here. There's some calculators you can plug your actual property in, or if you know what your actual value is or your assessed value, you can plug those numbers into this and it will help give you some examples. If you have questions, there's a box that you can check and you can submit us a question. We're happy to answer. So, to sign off on this, I would say that the complicated factor that we're dealing with is just as hard for us as it is for you. I understand it's hard to calculate with all these unknowns. Try putting a budget together based on this confusing numbers and the values that have been happening by the state. It's very challenging for all of us, not just the fire departments. I said the counties, the schools, the metro districts, the mosquito districts, the library districts, everybody's suffering by this the same complicated math, including the assessors that are having to figure out and do all this math on all these properties. So pretty crazy system that we have, but it's the one that we've got. It's what we've got to live with. So thanks for your time. If you have questions, let us know. Appreciate you taking the time to stick through the whole video to learn about taxes. Thank you.